So he thinks about this general's army weaving on this long, skinny road through hostile territory, and he says, "I don't know if that's going to work, sir." Now, he says, although he had some doubts and fears, quote, "I ventured only to say, to be sure, sir, if you arrive well before Duquesne with these fine troops, so well provided with artillery, the fort, though completely fortified and assisted with a very strong garrison, can probably make but a short resistance. The only danger I apprehend of obstruction to your march is from the ambuscades of the Indians, who by constant practice are dexterous in laying and executing them, and the slender line, near 4 miles long, which your army must make, may expose it to be attacked by surprise in its flanks, and to be cut like a thread into several pieces, which from their distance cannot come up in time to support each other." So he gives the general the best, most succinct summation of his possible come defeat. General smiles at my ignorance and replies, "These savages may indeed be formidable enemy to your raw American militia, but upon the King's regular and disciplined troops, sir, it is impossible that they should make any impression. I was conscious of an impropriety in my disputing with a military man in matters of his profession, and said no more." You know, when you say modern physics is full of a bit of humbug, and a physicist comes up and says, "What are you talking about?" You can't really argue with him, can you? The enemy, however, did not take the advantage of his army which I apprehended in its long line of march exposed to it, but let it advance without interruption until it was within 9 miles of the place. So they didn't just immediately attack him on the march like he thought they would. Then, once they were within 9 miles of the place, when more in a body, for it had just passed a river where the front had halted till all were come over, so they just allowed the army to come across the river, and in a more open part of the woods than it had passed, attacked its advance guard by a heavy fire from behind trees and bushes, which was the first intelligence the general had of an enemy's being near him. So they're against a river. This guard being disordered, the general hurried the troops up to their assistance, which was done in great confusion through wagons, baggage, and cattle, and presently the fire came upon their flank. The officers, being on horseback, were more easily distinguished, picked out as marks, and fell very fast. Ouch! And the soldiers were crowded together in a huddle, having or hearing no orders, and standing to be shot at till 2/3 of them were killed. And then, being seized with a panic, the remainder fled with precipitation. If they're not given an order to fire, they can be seriously reprimanded for firing. So they just stand in groups and get shot down. The wagoners took each a horse out of his team and scampered. The wagoners had been hired at great cost by the military from the farmers of Pennsylvania. So the farmers take their wagons and their team, unhitch their teams in some cases, and leave the wagons full of provisions and stuff to try to get out of there. Their example was immediately followed by others, so that all the wagons, provisions, artillery, and stores were left to the enemy. The general, being wounded, was brought off with difficulty. His secretary, Mr. Shirley, was killed by his side, and out of 86 officers, 63 were killed or wounded, and 714 men killed of 1,100 men. These 1,100 had been picked from the whole army. They were hand-picked troops. The rest had been left behind with Colonel Dunbar, who was to follow with the heavier part of the stores, provisions, and baggage. The flyers, not being pursued, arrived at Dunbar's camp, and the panic they brought with them instantly seized him and all his people. So they thought, the Indians have crushed our forward army, and they are certainly now going to be on the march to destroy everything back here. And though he had now above 1,000 men, and the enemy who had beaten Braddock had not at most exceeded 400 Indians and French together, instead of proceeding and endeavoring to recover some of the lost honor, he ordered all the stores, ammunition, etc. to be destroyed. that he might have more horses to assist his flight toward the settlements and less lumber to remove. So he's going to flee to the coast. Destroys all the stuff that they can't take with them. He was there met with requests from the governors of Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania that he should post troops on the frontiers so as to afford some protection to the inhabitants. But he continued his hasty march through all the country, not thinking himself safe till he arrived at Philadelphia, where the inhabitants could protect him. This whole transaction gave us Americans the first suspicion that our exalted ideas of the prowess of British regular troops had not been well founded. Interesting hint for the future revolutionaries. See how the King's troops fight the Indians, which the Americans live with in their backyard. In their first march, too, from their landing till they got beyond the settlements, they had plundered and stripped the inhabitants, totally ruining some poor families, besides insulting, abusing, and confining the people if they remonstrated. This was enough to put us out of conceit of such defenders if we had really wanted any. How different was the conduct of our French friends in 1781, who during a march through the most inhabited parts of our country, from Rhode Island to Virginia, near 700 miles, occasioned not the smallest complaint. Get this, they didn't even occasion the smallest complaint for the loss of a pig, a chicken, or even an apple. It's certainly something of an exaggeration. He's very, very fond of the French at this point, and they're very thankful to the French because the French helped us in the Revolution. So he would berate the English a bit and exalt the French just a bit, I'm sure. But that the whole army marching through didn't steal an apple? Not even a crime that was convicted even? Not even that? Captain Orme, O-R-M-E, who was one of the general's aides-de-camp, and being grievously wounded, was brought off with him and continued with him to his death, which happened in a few days. He had told me that he was totally silent all the first day, and at night only said, "Who would have thought it?" So, just didn't say anything, and then finally said, "Who would have thought it?" Then he was silent again, the following day, saying only at last, "We shall better know how to deal with them another time," and died in a few minutes. It's kind of spooky. He had lost track of the fact that he himself was not going to be on the scene. He realized the army, the institution of humanity, was going to deal with them better in the future, having learned from his experience. And he didn't quite realize, if his sentence bears his real thoughts, he didn't quite realize that he wasn't going to be around for that. But he was delusional and died a few minutes later. Now, Franklin had helped him get the wagons for the army and stuff, and so afterwards he says, "As to rewards from him, from the general, I asked only one, which was that he would give orders to his officers not to enlist any more of our bought servants, purchased servants, black people, and that he would discharge such as had been already enlisted." So Franklin says, "Our slaves are important to us. Could you please release the ones you have and stop enlisting them?" This he readily granted, and several were accordingly returned to their masters on my application. Dunbar, when the command devolved on him, was not so generous. He being at Philadelphia on his retreat, or rather flight, I applied to him for the discharge of the servants of 3 poor farmers in Lancaster County that he had enlisted, reminding him of the late general's orders on that head. He promised me that if the masters would come to him at Trenton, where he should be in a few days' march to New York, he would there deliver their men to them. They accordingly were at the expense and trouble going to Trenton, did arrive at Trenton, and there he refused to perform his promise, to their great loss and disappointment. As soon as the loss of the wagons and horses was generally known, all the owners came upon me for the valuation which I had given bond to